So we're talking about the challenge posed by the immersive would be one way of talking about it, getting out of the one-point perspective, but in your case, the things you can do because of one-point perspective. One thought I just had very quickly, by the way, is those big screens are happening in a world where, in fact, most of us are watching things on smaller and smaller screens. And if it is indeed true that big characters need big screens, what happens to us when we watch them on iPhones and so forth? It's an interesting problem. But John, maybe we'll start with you since we saw the bullet. Can you basically take off wherever you want from the challenge, but the challenge of the immersive and how film might move to get away from the vice of one-point perspective.
Okay, thank you. Hello, David. Very nice to see you. Gosh, well, it's interesting. Like we're here representing Hollywood since we have lots of torn interests here, and I also would say that there is a few things that I think directly relates in terms of the stuff that we do and know can be done that isn't properly seen its day yet. And what I would say is that there are different objectives going on in the construction of a film, but there's also the experience part of it, the experience of making it, and the experience that we're hoping that the audience has. And there is, to pivot on the word experience, I think, is how you set up the future. We do look at the construction of films almost like a sculpture, if you will. And there is it's dynamic, as you're sort of experiencing it, but it is in and of itself a sort of like a frozen sort of result.
It's interesting, by the way, you say that. I was talking with Florian yesterday. My grandfather was a Hollywood composer from out of Weimar, Germany, and he used to talk about music as architectonic, by which he meant that it was, and it's the same thing with narrative, that it is architecture across time.
Without doubt.
And in a way, you're talking about sculpture across time in a certain way, but he would talk about the constrictions and the widening out and the rise and that was what music did, was trying to do that, and the structure of the film was like a cathedral or whatever. And in a way, you're saying the same thing, like using the metaphor of sculpture.
Yes, absolutely. And what I think is the somewhat of a frustration, perhaps, in how we sort of bridge across, is that the end result is a locked rectangle. The end result is a locked rectangle, actually. So, in a way, again, you're looking through a pinhole back at, and there is a frustration with that, perhaps, from an experience point of view for some, but you are obviously sort of affected. You are held, and in being held, you can be compelled, and things can really resonate. And usually, that which resonates, of course, are moments, performance, story, and things of that nature. And so, if I don't expect to be able to ever make something as compelling as Francis Ford Coppola, that's why I go to see his films. Right? I want to see his sculpture. That does not mean that I would not like to immerse myself in some fashion inside of the universe, but perhaps in a separate experience. And so what I do think is that, the experience of a film is as it is. Everyone knows it's like a language. We don't have to explain that there is a sort of intuitive other language that everybody knows, the language of composition and editing, and we don't have to be, any person can understand this language, and it is appreciated by many, but it isn't locked. I mean, these things are not necessarily locked, and I think we're going to see an unlocking in not too long in the future.
Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
Okay, well, if you are actually a person who makes movies, you know, these gentlemen, if you could put yourself in our shoes and you are there during the actual act of making this film, so we're there inside, the sets are there, we're walking through these things, we're witnessing the performances live before our eyes. We're actually experiencing that movie in a way that no other audience member ever gets. There is the ultimate immersive experience of a movie is during the act of creation. So the question that I have is if the camera and the monocular view, which is part of the sculpture, you know, that the director and cinematographer are making, you know, there are ways that we already know of that we do all the time, but discard as a secondary experience that we can actually acquire all of this in a more volumetric fashion. We use these tools all the time in visual effects because we have to understand the shapes of things and where light comes from and all of that. And there are all sorts of things. What is not really built yet, which I think the gentlemen who are coming on next are all about, is a platform upon which we can potentially place you volumetrically into some of these experiences. Now, would that be the same as following Francis Ford Coppola's sculpture? No, but it doesn't mean that we might not want to at some point jump off of that branch once we've had his experience. I'll say that. We can go back in if you want.
That puts me in mind of two things. One is Walter Murch was hoping to be here today. Unfortunately, he is working on a film. Damn it. And they are behind, and they're going all weekends through Christmas in Vancouver. But it's interesting that when Apocalypse Now was first being made by Francis, and Walter basically working on the sound thing, the trouble was that there was no theater in America that could do that sound. And they were originally, Francis's first idea was that Apocalypse Now would show in one theater in America, custom built in Kansas. And then it was explained that this is probably not a good idea on the financial side, among other things. And so then, in fact, what happened is that they went to every theater where it was shown had to be retrofitted with what has now become the standard but it was Apocalypse Now going from theater to theater, and the films immediately afterwards that changed all the theaters that they could absorb the thwack, thwack, thwack of the helicopters and so forth that had been worked on. The other thing, by the way, just as you were talking, it occurred to me, I had a correspondence some years ago with Larry McMurtry, and it was after Lonesome Dove had come out. And if those of you who've read Lonesome Dove or even seen the miniseries, the care and the love which he lavishes on characters, who he just then kills off, you know, in the most horrified ways, and so subtly, snake bite, drowning, this and that, you know. And the question I was asking him was, when he would do that one morning, you know, in the terms of your volumetric being there when it's being made, did he go around for the rest of the day really sad that that character was dead, the way I did? Another way of putting it is, were the characters more or less real for him than they were for us? Did he pull off a killing of a character and then go, God, that was great, that was really cool? How you know, is he the only person in America who knows that those characters aren't real?
Yeah.
Because you know, the rest of us are just like, totally, oh my God, he was very blasé about it. So yeah, no, it was just a good day's work, you know. But anyway, Florian, do you want to take up on some of the things you're thinking about?
Well, first of all, let me tell you what a thrill it is really to be here at this at this symposium, because you know it feels to me like listening to all the incredibly interesting things that are being said and thought about. That I think normally these are things I only think about in my head, and I almost go crazy over them, and suddenly I find people. Yeah, that's right. But I mean, to see that so many other people take these questions seriously and think about that all the time is just very comforting and makes me feel a lot less crazy. So I was introduced to this to David's Cubism when David and I met a year and a half ago in summer, and I said to him I was so sad to have missed the beautiful show in London, and he said, you know, I actually did a little film about it. I'll show it to you. And on his iPad, you know, so I was a little bit worried about that because films about exhibitions or anything like that are normally, I mean, I've had to watch my share of them. I find them incredibly dull because it just makes you miss the exhibition all the more. Same thing with theater when it's filmed. It's just there's something so dead about it. And so I was thinking that this was going to be an experience like that and make me even more sad to have not been in London. And so on David's little iPad, he showed me just a 3-camera film that he did about that exhibition, and it was really so that when it was over, I said, I want to watch it again. It was almost as if, as the viewer, I was really taking part in the artistic experience. I was given that bit of artistic freedom that I feel I needed, and it looked so much more modern and so much more exciting. And you know, I'm not at all. So these were just 3 cameras set one next to the other. David was on a simple makeshift dolly, and that he was pushing himself. It was also very interesting because you really see the exhibition through David's eyes. I mean, this film, I don't think it's available, right? But I mean, it is really it's incredible.
So by the way, one camera is looking this way, one camera is looking that way, one camera is looking this way.
Yeah, it's pretty similar to the principle of all the films that you've seen there. Only that it was only 3. But even that is enough to give you an exciting visual experience that actually makes you I feel that film does have a problem in that it somehow disenfranchises the viewer. And this makes you become an active part of it and gives you slightly your own perspective. Now, I really don't believe in, for example, interactive cinema and all that, where you're allowed to choose where a story goes and all that. I find that very frustrating as a viewer, and as the idea is to have to make that, because I do think that there is a necessary path that a story has to go. But I did really get an incredible kick of artistic autonomy out of seeing these it shot that way, and I've been really thinking about it ever since. And then another very interesting experience was about a year later when we met at your house in Los Angeles. David showed me a Vogue magazine from 1984, where, I mean, Vogue is always such a funny thing to read, or any magazine really, because they're so incredibly dated and so much of their own time. And, you know, you start leafing through that magazine and it has, you know, that specific shade of red that people were wearing then, and those crazy hair and the shoulder pads and all the 80s cliches. They're true. It's all there. And then there was a stretch of, I'd say about 20 pages that for some reason David had designed in there. And it was really like, one of the first images was the desk, that incredibly fresh look at something that we've seen a million times. And it immediately brought you weirdly into the present. And it was really as if a time traveler had come and had created 20 pages and somehow deposited them there in 1984. And that made me think that, you know, what is that exactly? Why? So it gives you a sense of freedom and freshness, and I think it has to do with the fact that you can make a little bit of your own film or a little bit of your own photography even by entering into these multiple perspectives. Otherwise, you're just, after a while, you're forced to look at things that you aren't really wanting to look at, and you realize how dated a film is. And I mean, that's always to me a big thing in films. I always, when I conceive anything, even my short films, I always thought, okay, how do I make something that no one will ever be able to date? I mean, it has to be of here and now somehow, or of the period that you describe, but I don't want it ever to feel like those epic biblical films from the 60s where, you know, you have 60s girls running around with their 60s attitudes, you know, and so I really think that this method helps in an almost somehow, I don't know, supernatural way. And it also tied into many things that I discovered for myself as a director. So on my last film, I worked with a DP who was John Seal, a brilliant Australian director of photography. You've probably worked with him, right? No, okay. So we've And he had invented this, this way of setting light that you can immediately reverse the light without losing any time, which is a big factor in making films. And then he took it even further so that he really cross-shoots two sides at the same time, so you can have a dialogue between the two actors, and without really losing any of the beauty of the light, he can
It's
film
interesting, by the way,
both of
most
us.
people, when you see cinematographer in the credits, you think that's the person who shot the film. It's really the person who lit the film.
Yes,
That's
yeah.
what a cinematographer does. Yeah.
Yes, that is absolutely the main thing. I mean, mostly, I know very few directors who leave, let's say, the actual framing or anything to the DP, and but you're right. The lighting, that is something that comes very much from the eye of the cinematographer, and so we started cross-shooting scenes, and I really hated it. Because it gave me exactly the feeling that you had when watching, what was the film called with the 4 different time code. Because I just felt my brain was not big enough to compute this or direct this. So, I mean, the DP's brain obviously was, he did it incredibly well, but I told him that we can't do this. Let's shoot all cameras the same direction, because I just don't know where to be looking when I'm directing this. So it really frustrated him, because one of the great kicks that he gets out of being a DP, because he has this super mind, is he can see time code in his, he can see 6 different images in his head at the same time while it's being set up. But I found it very hard to direct, and I also found that the actors were getting a little frustrated with it, because you were only giving one side feedback for something and had only coincidentally looked at the other side. And so, but what we then did is we used all the cameras to actually shoot into one direction. I really didn't mind that because actors actually do something. They know what lens you have on the camera when they're experienced, and they really only act for the part that you're shooting. And I think it leads to somehow slightly disjointed performances, because they know, okay, well, now you're close in their face, they're really going to do an expressive face. Oh, this is a wide shot, let's really act with my full body and not give too much attention to that. It's and by shooting all into one direction and editing it afterwards, you somehow had a more full body, I think, acting experience. But of course, you still always have, I'm still always looking for one specific thing. I'm looking at one specific thing, and I do know that I think if the image is well constructed, the viewer will also look at what I was looking at there. But you are not allowing the actor to show his full creativity. And somehow when I saw David's method of shooting, you're covering the same ground, all one direction, but giving people the choice where to go, I have this really firm conviction that will allow the viewers to experience the film really as a director and have almost the experience that you're talking about, that's incredibly immersive experience of, in a way, making my own film, guided gently by the director, who at the end of the day is nothing other than the first spectator. You know, so
Diderot famously says that the painter is merely the first witness of the completed painting.
yes, and I think I think that's even more the case in films, because in films, since you're not really creating that, there's not a blank canvas there before. You're working with existing elements, and if you think about it, the experience of acting is actually for movies is a very unnatural experience. I think the natural experience is what we're having here. You're an actor, you have a part, you play for the audience, you get a kind of feedback, you adjust accordingly, you target it at, it's this beautiful back and forth. And now some perverted genius has invented a camera that allows you to somehow do away with this audience completely, and everybody's doing their technical things. The DP is fiddling with the lighting, and people are putting up flags and everything and decorating, and there's only one person who's there as an audience. One person, and that's the director. I'm the audience, and so I have to kind of replace for the 10,000 people in the arena. I have to replace them in the intensity of my gaze. But my gaze is
So, like, when we look at the films about Hitchcock making films, everybody was looking at the scene as it was happening, and that's not the case anymore.
Those were Hitchcock was and he was a terrific filmmaker. He was also the greatest PR genius ever. He would stage every picture. He would have, when they say that he designed everything so exactly by storyboards, there was just a book published actually that showed that he had the storyboards for North by Northwest, which happened, the scene happened pretty coincidentally on the set. He had them done post factum, so
Totally.
people would say, wow, this genius.
But the thing I'm pointing out, but my fantasy is in the old days in Hollywood, everybody would be looking at the scene as it was happening, and that's not the case anymore as much?
No, I'd say that, I mean, I've rarely, no. I mean, maybe.
I don't think it ever was.
Maybe, yeah, I think you're right. I don't think it ever.
Everybody has a job to do, and you get tired, you know. And after like 4 hours, you're tired, and you still have 8 hours more to go. So.
And we're not even talking about the Teamsters at that point.
No, so I really think that I see. I really, I mean, ever since David showed me these films, and since we saw them under those, you know, the same perfect conditions that you're seeing them here in his studio in Los Angeles, I had that feeling of something that you once said to me in email. You said that you feel so many areas of culture and politics and philosophy are stuck. And I really got that feeling. I mean, it's almost like a kind of like a virus with which you infected me on that. I do feel things feel stuck now, you know, and that's why I'd really. I mean, I've been thinking ever since of how to conceive, you know, what hopefully will still be the first full-length narrative feature using exactly David's system, because and I think the interesting thing would be to take a very, you know, classical, traditional narrative, you know, the kind of film that you would always make in the regular way, and show, look, you're experiencing something very much, you know, kind of a certain genre, and now see how it feels with this additional perspective. Because I think if you were to turn this into like an art film or something like that, it would be too hard for people to understand how powerful this is, because they're, you know, dealing with the stress of having to digest an art film, you know, and so, yeah, I mean, I really, I think it's. I really think it's an incredible invention. I actually think, in a certain way,
Will there be trains in your picture?
I think they're it's almost as similar. I was interested in what you said about the fact that we started out with with seeing everything from one perspective and not cutting, and then somehow people came to understand that cutting was not disconcerting to the audience, which, if you think about it, is really a much more radical step, because, you know, generally one would say, you don't perceive life in, you know, oh, now I see all of Dennis, now I see this watch, you know, you don't, but the interesting thing is that it really is. This is a discovery that Walter Murch made, Ren's friend, who said that we do perceive the world in cuts, and that is. And why is that? It's because we blink. So basically, I'm moving around. I blink. That means a short moment of black. And the next image I say, I have to seamlessly connect to the other one. And it can be a completely different image. You know, if I'm running, if I'm falling, if I'm moving quickly, if I'm even, you know, moving back and forth in my chair, I have two completely different images that I have to glue together, as long as they stick to certain rules of the axis, which, you know, it's very unlikely that I'd blink and then be on the other side of Dennis, so that would be disconcerting to the audience. So I actually think that this invention, which at first seems so outrageous and, well, oh, this is a nice kind of artistic experiment, no, it actually could be the next cut, the next editing. It really could take it to that level. I think that it's possible, because you know, I really think when David explained that to me, and I really felt that I kind of understood something, and that happens to me pretty rarely, because, you know, I actually feel that, like, if I feel that there's something that I've understood, I want to make a film about it. Like, I'd understood for myself the incredible injustice of surveillance. You know, I mean, that's something I feel like I understand on a very deep level. And that led me to want to make the lives of others. I feel like I understood the incredible beauty of Venice, and that's not a hard one to understand, but and the real beauty of Angelina Jolie, and those two things were really just showcasing that. To me, was the impulse to actually go and make The Tourist. I feel like I've really understood how this is a way to make, you know, in a way to take the audience more seriously, and to have an experience that would allow you to to see life as it actually is from different perspective centers. And it kind of retroactively also helped me to understand Picasso more. I mean, of course, everybody accepts the, let's say, pure male power and just expressiveness of the things, but this idea that actually the representation of a face by Picasso, post-Cubism Picasso, can be truer than the single view which he'd painted at before.
David, for example, makes a great point that the Marie-Thérèse paintings, where you have the two eyes on the same side of the head and so forth, are not
monsters
at all. They are what it looks like when you're in bed with your lover.
Yeah.
When you are really close, the eyes start to want. And if you took a photograph of that, that's not what the person looks like. It is indeed the case that the eyes are both in the wrong and so forth, and that conveys a kind of sense of intimacy.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. And the picture of David's mother, for instance, I mean, that would, if you describe that objectively, people would imagining it as a single picture would think of as a horrendous monster, but actually you see a very loving portrait of a woman, and it doesn't bother you, those things, because it's what's happening on a deeper level in your head. Mm-hmm. Anyway, so now in a way the challenge will be to convince the system, which is at its least original point, since the invention of the motion picture films. And I mean,
it has always been at its least original point.
No, I don't actually think so. I mean, it's really something. I would say that most people agree that the last 15 years of filmmaking have been the weakest in film history.
Really?
That's not, I mean, even people in Hollywood, everybody kind of, so I think that's not, I'm not deploring that and saying the world is going down. The world can very well go up. People like David Hockney are ensuring that, it means you have to push through a barrier and find a new dimension. I think this really could be a very important breakthrough. It could actually be that once you see that, so at the end of the exhibition film that David made, he has one section where he films a section just with one camera, and you think you're back in the 50s, and it feels like I don't know, a teacher is explaining to you how this exhibition was, so it looks very poor in comparison. I think that it's possible that this could be like that really David for film has invented a kind of Hockeyan Cubism. I mean, that this is. I really think this could be like Cubism. I mean, after Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, nothing in painting was the same, right? Somehow things had come through, or maybe after Cézanne, or as soon as those kind of elements emerged, nothing was the same, and it spilled over into every single field. Into I don't know, Le Corbusier would not be possible without. I mean, in music, you have so many examples. In film, we've somehow stubbornly stayed resistant to it because, of course, a film experiment immediately entails at least $20 million.
Dennis, are you having some of the same kinds of thoughts in terms of the last 15 years and what's moving forward?
Yeah, I'm still looking through the Cyclops eye, but I think there's a potential with 3D, with more bolder directors directing for the subject matter with less cuts. Mm-hmm. And I like the high frame rate because it looks more real. But that's all dealing with the concepts that we're in now. Mm-hmm. Certainly a different way of experiencing something would be terrific. It's not anything I've managed to pursue at all.
What about Gravity in this? David, have you seen Gravity, the film Gravity, yet? Does that seem to be kind of some stuff that wasn't possible before?
I was extremely put off by the physics that drove me nuts in that film. And it's not the hair, it's the fact that suddenly George Clooney's being pulled for some reason. Right. So he has to cut himself, and then he slows down long enough to say goodbye. And oh, by the way, over there is the Russian one we can get to.
Chuck Jones could tell you that wasn't going to happen.
I know, yeah. And the weird thing is that I normally don't care at all about that stuff, but for that film somehow it bothered me. But the look was beautiful of it, beautiful. So,
I mean, I think I was actually, while I was listening to your talk, I was also thinking of Gravity, and I could have, I was saying.
Let's describe why for people who haven't seen Gravity. Okay, what's interesting about it?
Gravity is very interesting in that, in a way, it purports to be a completely visual, visceral experience. In a certain way, I think of it not as a movie because it actually really doesn't have much of a script. I mean, I'd be interested to read that script. It's, oh, then the
You're
meteors
finished. It's
come.
over.
Yeah, I mean, it's really, you know, the meteors come. She gets out of the space station, flies to the next station. You know, more stuff floating around. Another hail of meteor shower. I mean, there really isn't a story, but. So it's more like a ride. It really is it's an experience ride of you are in space. You know, I saw it with my 10-year-old daughter, and afterwards she said, "Daddy, I'm never going to go to space." and that's kind of the experience that it's about. But I mean, it's terrific. It's an immersive experience, but it certainly does not. It does not do what you're doing. How does this bridge break? How is it built? It's no, you know, you can hang on with one hand to something in a meteor shower and your body flaps around and you can still pull yourself back in. But it's very interesting that a film which really is an incredibly successful space ride. So it really, did you ever see that Universal Studios Back to the Future ride, which I loved? I mean, I think they've shut it down for some crazy reason. I mean, it was still, what?
I worked on it.
Oh, you worked on it? I mean, that.
It's my first job.
Really? I mean, I always think that was like the high mark for any ride, you know, and this is good too. I mean, it doesn't read quite Back to the Future ride, but it's a ride, and it's so interesting that is now being hailed as, you know, an incredible artwork. I think it's very interesting to see kind of what, but it's,
What was
you know.
so great about the Back to the Future ride?
You were.
Okay, you want me to explain? I'll tell you why that was a cool ride. Because the man who made that was the godfather of immersion with Douglas Trumbull.
Oh, yes.
And Douglas Trumbull used to do a lot of things to completely unhinge the norms of how you make a movie. So that's a very interesting one to bring up, because if he could not photograph a scene with enough, you know, visual information in the frame, he would literally make his own lens, and he would literally make his own cameras, which he did for that ride. No one knows this stuff because we didn't really have as much chatter, you know, bloggy stuff back then. But Doug Trumbull made IMAX cameras that were this big, you know, like 70 mil. They're usually this big. 70 millimeter film fit into a box this big. And then he invented the first ever carbon graphite motion control system that was created from an overhead gantry system, because he wanted to reach things that you could never reach with cameras before. So he just made that. And with that, you had to completely come up with a new way to design camera pathing through a scene. And then on top of that, he's like, well, I don't have a screen that can appropriately facilitate this, so he made Omnimax, basically. And he wanted that, so you were literally inside, right? So that person deserves some recognition, just because he really is one person who has thought about this idea of the experience, about being inside. And of course, it's still to some degree passive, and you know, he added a 6-axis motion base, you know, which is something we would, like when I was 22 years old, we would sneak in at night, and my friends programmed that. So we would have parties in the Omnimax screen, and we had a slider, and we could just slide.
That is cool.
And there is like a whole thing along those lines. But Doug Trumbull also invented ShowScan, which was 60 FPS. And the reason for that is because he wanted to start playing with the idea of hyperreality. And there is with high frame rate and light done in a particular way, then it has somewhat of a physiological effect on you as a viewer. And you know, I think, well, you see James Cameron right now is working very hard to reinvent how films are perceived. He's making high frame rate cameras, high frame rate projectors. He's working with, I can't say exactly, other interests that are looking to change the entire view on how depth perception and resolution works. We've seen some stuff, Dennis and I which are so exponential beyond anything you probably have seen in a theater. Theater is, at this point, and both Doug Trumbull and James Cameron would agree that the state of affairs in theaters and projection is absolutely abysmal. But both of them are aiming towards not just, moving beyond just the sculpture into, like, I step into the universe. So you have thinkers like that going on. You have also a big bang in capture approaches, which allow us to, through not one camera, but lots of cameras and sensors and other technologies sort of acquire all things. And so there are ways already that we're moving very past the sort of two-dimensional sort of barrier. Because like I go and I see movies and I think about being outside all the time. I think about being outside the painting, outside the film, and I look at that as like there is still a flat plane. Now, we're working very hard to get inside the plane, right? We want to stand close enough. We want the sort of like physiological, psychological impact of...
Will that have to be something that takes place in a theater as opposed to on your living room, plasma screen?
That's a really good question. So I think in about 10 years, we're going to laugh at the proliferation of simple rectangles everywhere, right? Because we are already building, like Blaze, who's coming on here, is going to show you how he's got the V.1 of the Matrix on as a project. That we're building the sort of dimensional world slowly but surely, and we're coming up with methods of sort of digesting. But, how people choose to experience. So, for example, immersive projection or immersive, like entire living room will be a screen at some point, all four sides and the walls, right? There's lots of stuff going on with virtual VR goggles right now. There's like a big bang space race because it's been deemed suddenly commercially viable for, at least in the gaming community, to be inside these dimensional play experiences. There is, of course, Google, with Google Glasses, and so you want to go 10 years where everybody's basically recording their memories, right, and putting them up into the cloud, and then sharing them so that I can at some point take the view of somebody else's perspective on an event or a moment, right?
Please don't do that.
No, it's gonna. No, I don't know whether it's their plans, but the world in 10 years is going to be like an absolute massive bank of memories.
I think you need to make a new movie called The Lives of Us. in the wake of NSA, especially.
Well, I mean, it is hard to understand. I mean, we were just talking about that earlier at dinner, that political cinema doesn't really, there's no real thriving culture of that.
Yeah.
And that is really what would be needed right now. But, that's not what I think what the system is ready to make.
So listen, I think we'll stop in a second, but without Walter here, I will channel Walter Murch, who I was getting all depressed before this panel, but and now this panel has made me happier. But in the same way, I was having this really depressing conversation with Walter a few weeks ago about global warming and how hopeless the Senate is, and it's completely a mess, and it's going to go. We were really depressed, and he says, "Well, think of the world from the point of view of the growing chick. The growing chick inside of an egg. It starts out as yellow and yolk, and the yellow gradually becomes a fetus, and the yolk is what it's going to eat. And day by day gets bigger and bigger, and it's eating and eating all the stuff, and it's pushing all of its waste to the edges. And at a certain point, there's no more room, and it's getting bigger and bigger, and it's just surrounded by all this crap, this waste, and it's choking in this soup of horribleness. And then peck, peck, peck. It opens out onto a whole new universe. And I allowed that little wonderful image to sit for a second, and I said, yeah, an industrial chicken farm. but having said that, this is a little bit what you guys are, we are 15 years of stuckenness and so forth, but it sounds like things may be about to we may be about to peck. And we thank the master chick, David Hockney, for that.